My father was arrested in the summer of 1948. Estonia was now under the Soviet regime, but he was still working as a school teacher. The local Department of Education asked him to come by. He went dressed in summer clothes and wearing sandals, and he never came back. At midnight, we heard someone banging at the door. We opened it, and soldiers came in and demanded our passports. We put the passports on the table, and they just said, "You are under arrest." Pagare prison in Tallinn was a place everyone was afraid of, and I was afraid too. I remember that I was taken down the steps to the basement to a long corridor. There was nothing in the cell besides a bench. They slammed the door shut, and that is when I became a little scared. But then I prayed to Jehovah to help me, and a sense of peace came over me. I lay down on the bench and fell asleep. I was given a 10-year prison sentence as an enemy of the state. I saw Jehovah's help in that things were never too hard for me to bear. If things were getting too difficult, something would always change so that I could cope. There was always that feeling that someone was looking after me. I never felt alone or abandoned. If only we could be faithful all the time, then we would also be happy. But sometimes we fail, and so we lose joy. Faithfulness gives joy. In prison, you can stay faithful if you don't leave Jehovah, and if you don't forget to pray, and if you always remember why you are there. You are there because you are on Jehovah's side. I was not a thief. I was not a killer. But I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and that is worth being in prison for.
We've been hearing the story of Aino Kethma, a Jehovah's Witness lady from Estonia, relating her experience of being persecuted due to her Jehovah's Witness faith. It goes without saying, I am strongly against the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it's deplorable when governments, usually totalitarian regimes, as we're seeing now in Russia, effectively trample the human rights, the rights to freedom of worship of any religious minority, including Jehovah's Witnesses. I just find it unfortunate that when this happens, a byproduct is that groups like Jehovah's Witnesses that are themselves abusive and are themselves totalitarian in depriving people their human rights leap on these stories for propaganda value, and that's exactly what we've seen here. There are elements of this story, particularly the concluding remarks in this story, that play directly into the Jehovah's Witness agenda.
Faithfulness gives joy. In prison, you can stay faithful if you don't leave Jehovah, and if you don't forget to pray, and if you always remember why you were there.
I think the message there is very clear, isn't it? Don't leave Jehovah. Jehovah's Witnesses watching this will be thinking, well, if Sister Kethma can stay faithful despite going through that ordeal, I can surely stay faithful to Jehovah, to the organization, when I'm not in prison and when I'm not experiencing that much adversity. It's again blatant manipulation, isn't it? It's trying to sell this idea that under no circumstances should you ever consider quitting. You also have this message woven into Aino's story that she received this magical assistance in staying faithful.
I saw Jehovah's help in that things were never too hard for me to bear. If things were getting too difficult, something would always change so that I could cope.
If things were getting too difficult, something would always change so that I could cope. So there was some kind of divine intervention that I now was blessed with that enabled her to just magically get through, magically cope, no matter how difficult things got. And this actually reminded me of a verse that, I'm going to be honest, my dad was always banging on about. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13. Well, he didn't say, oh, remember Lloyd, 1 Corinthians 10:13. He just used to use quotes that were very similar to this. And the scripture says, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to men, but God is faithful and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But along with the temptation, he will also make the way out so that you may be able to endure it. And Aino's experience just reminded me of this, just this repeated mantra of, oh, God will never let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, which of course is nonsense. Plenty of people have to deal with things that they can't bear, including Jehovah's Witnesses. All this does, alluding to what I was saying earlier in Patrick Lafranca's comments, is layer on guilt. Because if you do experience something that you can't bear, if you do experience anxiety or depression that's simply unbearable, all this sort of thinking does is tell you that it's your fault if you can't cope. Because if you can't cope, if you really, really can't cope with what life's throwing at you, whether it's to do with the fact that you're in a cult and you're being asked to chase your tail and do all of these insane rituals and waste your time constantly chasing after something that never quite solidifies, whether it's to do with your religion, whether it's to do with having to forgive someone who you can't forgive, whether it's to do with anything really, this verse or this sort of idea is inevitably going to make you hate yourself for being unable to cope, because of course you're going to think the reason I can't cope is because I'm not being blessed enough, and I'm not being blessed enough because there's something wrong with me.